I just wanted to introduce Andrew for the lecture, but also to tell you a few of the events we have coming up so that you guys are aware of them. I know I received many emails from me and or Sean, multiple emails, which I think are needed, so you are here for some reason. But next week, we're going to have Todd Gannon, again, from 1 to 2 in the CAC. And then week 8, which is the 2nd of March, which I know it's a critical time, maybe before midterm, but it's Moss and Keep Me Stock. Last time I thought was actually interesting and very much relevant to what we're doing in Thesis. So although this is another class, the overlap becomes interesting and useful for all of us. So I would recommend you to be here. And finally, we have a week 11, the Thesis Symposium, which is a month. It's maybe 5 weeks away from now, and I just want to remind you and your instructors that probably in 3 or 4 weeks, Todd Gannon, Marcel and I will go through all the people that are interested in being part of the symposium. It's something that we've done for the past 5 years. It's a high moment of the school where we have guests coming from outside and looking at the work, and we select between 4 and 5 students that will present on the podium. And we haven't found a better way to do this rather than going through whoever wants to apply. So we recommend each of you to start thinking whether or not you want to go for it. You usually have 5 minutes to present your work to the audience and to the panelists of the symposium. And also we recommend the faculty to recommend the best people so that we can actually identify these people. I don't know all of you, and I don't know all the theses, so I need your help to do that. So thank you for this, and Andrew Zago lectures. And I wish, yes.
Unplug it, please.
Yes, sorry. Yes, how about that?
It's in light table mode. Perfect. Okay. So it's interesting, these talks that occur, and they've been occurring in I think in maybe in an increasingly more structured way over the last few years. Is that right, Elena? 5 years it's been happening, and I think they were originally considerably more sort of sitting around the library, I think, table, and now they've become something more. But I do think it's important that they're not, the way I see it, they're not lectures per se. They're part of a kind of an internal conversation and dialogue that we're having in the school, and that goes on for a few years. Probably one of the most important things that and this is, I'm saying in part to the students, that there is, you're here for a certain amount of time. We're here for a little longer. I suppose SCI-Arc is here even longer. But it is a kind of a wave that moves through the school rather than a particular moment, like you've got to do your thesis and you're interested in that. I think there's a little bit of a responsibility to understand things as I know for a fact, because I said this to the introductory 1GA class 4 years ago on direct orders from Hernan, which is you tell them the 1GA studio is designed for graduate thesis, and that should be said for every other graduate studio as you go through. It's up to you to decide whether that happens or not, but that's certainly the goal of it. And so these past talks, and I think there was some discussion of recording or not recording. I think simply it's an interesting thing to just have a sense of an arc and a trajectory of what's happening. Last year I did a couple of things. I outlined some things that I thought it was a kind of fundamental turning point in thesis, that a number of things had happened, which was very important over a number of years. And more importantly than those things that had happened is that they had actually run their course, and there was a grave danger in not recognizing that and continuing that. I say that, I think in part, I think it was a reasonably well-received talk and had some impact on the discussion of things. But I think also it's important to cite that it was, to the extent that I was able to do that, me sort of listening to and thinking about and channeling a few other things that were going on. I mean, probably starting with the talk that Sylvia gave here. Well, this is Art Forum, it was 2012, so it must have been shortly before that, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that Sylvia spoke on the pavilion, at the end of the pavilion. Am I walking away from the microphone?
Okay. Just for the camera.
Okay. Sorry. After all that, I'm going to speak into the microphone. There were. It was a very unusual talk. It shows up later in Art Forum. I believe she wouldn't allow that one to be recorded because it was a kind of work in progress. And one of the things that she talks about in there was some anxiety about what would be the new area for experimental or the progressive edge, let's say, of radical exploration in architecture. And she was saying pavilions are over, but she was also speaking to a number of other things, and she couldn't put her finger on it. She was saying, I don't know how to express my thoughts without it sound, I remember her saying this, without it sounding like I'm talking about professional practice or something, and I don't mean that exactly. I thought that was interesting. And then Jeff's talk last year, a couple of talks that he gave leading up to Thesis, he was also trying to talk about other ways of engaging different aspects of the architectural project, taking it out of a kind of SCI-Arc mode, and also a number of discussions with colleagues. So what I tried to outline last year was really that moment as clearly as I could, obviously through my own lenses, but I think what we'd have to realize is it was a moment, just to recap a couple of things from it, that there was probably over the last 5-10 years here at SCI-Arc, there just gathered a number of people at a certain time in a certain place that seemed to be exactly right, that there were certain opportunities, in part I was arguing, maybe in part caused by a recession and us having an inordinate amount of time to spend at school, and maybe why a lot of students were here as well. But it also had to do with the kind of turning point of technology, a way of leveraging, I think, I would say finally, SCI-Arc's experimental posture into disciplinary questions, which I think is something that has typically eluded it over its history. And I think these things happened, and we can talk about it. I think it happened in a lot of ways, but I think graduate thesis is where one can see that most clearly. I think obviously Jeff's presence is a large part of this, but I think he was just a catalyst of a lot of things. I think there were a number of people and a number of things that were the catalyst for what happened. And I was basically pointing out that there was an incredible explosion of creative experimentation that happened at the school, that this was good, but one shouldn't imagine that simply creative exploration, and in particular creative exploration at a certain level of ambiguous open-endedness, is simply something that SCI-Arc can rehearse over and over again to great effect. I was arguing that it was that time to do that there was a kind of post-digital moment, a lot of moments where people were trying to figure out what to do, and SCI-Arc seemed to have a number of responses to that were unique and indeed quite unexpected. Let me see if I can move ahead. And I went through, I won't go through, this is for just a couple slides from last year, but I went through, I go, well, here's some of the topics, extrusions, buildings that move, narrative, it went on, and maybe this year, so I want to go through some of this just so you know what the talk is going to be. And really just try to go a little bit in more detail on a couple of things that were raised both in some of the thesis prep talks as well as the symposium, some thoughts that I had, and then I guess a number of other thoughts. So this is, I would guess last year I think I was able to make a kind of grand summary of something that was, I thought, changing after a number of years for gestation. I just don't do that again this year. If I was presenting that again this year, you ought to be suspicious, right? Like, this guy's just making this shit up. So I'm going to try to instead, this is a little more things that are on my mind that come from looking at some work, thinking about some recent discussions and things that have happened here in the school, and maybe we'll have a kind of resonance with things that we're talking about. So some of it will be about thesis, some of it will just be, I think, about where we are, what things we're working on as a school, and maybe even just as architects. So the one thing that I gave as a key thing, and this is something that I would reiterate. I was citing a couple of things. There were 2 or 3 texts that I mentioned, and I still strongly recommend them. 2 of them are quite short. T.S. Eliot, Tradition and the Individual Talent, which will address some things that I'm going to talk about in a minute. What is this idea of tradition and art? Is it also a slippery slope? The other one was The Decay of Lying by Oscar Wilde, which is short and also kind of hilarious. And then George Kubler, the Shape of Time, Remark on the History of Things, which is, I think, a very important text, a little longer. And finally, Rothko's Painter's Philosophy. Painter's Philosophy, I think that's it. It's a book that was put together from his notes posthumously by his son a few years back. But one of the things that Kubler talks about is basically really separating this idea that, which is an easy enough fiction to maintain, that you are an individual and you can simply think of and work on something of your choosing, and it is a limitless set of possibilities of things that you can work on. And that is, it is a true feeling, and as such is sort of valid, but doesn't always measure up against the facts of things. And he's arguing that there is a kind of series of strands and flows and continuities and discontinuities simply in the form of things themselves, that forms of pottery, forms of music, forms of architecture, that there is novel formulations that are introduced, that these get developed, that these get disputed, that they fall into disuse, that they're picked up in later times, and that at any given point, one enters the world somewhere in this flow. That's the part it's not your choice. You have choices to operate within the range of things that are happening at that time, and you have some possibility to make some leaps, out of that, but it is always relative to this thing. And so this is the point, this one sentence that I brought up last year: without a good entrance, the artist is in danger of wasting his time as a copyist, regardless of temperament or training. So that means that my argument was, and you could certainly disagree with this, is that this idea that my thesis is going to open up in a very raw and unfiltered way some brand new aesthetic territory is basically not doing that, but copying what was happening in Thesis in past years. It doesn't matter whether you're aware of it, doesn't matter if this is not at all what you want to do. I'm going to argue this is the reality that one enters into, and not realizing this. So again, regardless of your temperament or training, it becomes wasting your time as a copyist. And this is probably what I was arguing was our biggest danger. So it's not a question of talent, which I'll talk about later, because talent's an interesting thing relative to architecture and relative to this place. But Kubler was saying it was meaningless to talk about which, an artist that we consider being one of the most important in the history of art, and another one that we think was pretty important. But maybe the one was pretty important. It doesn't matter which was more talented, which is more insight. It also is that there were certain questions and certain things that one artist could address because it was exactly the right time to do so, and then the next person comes along 5 or 10 years later and it's already answered. It's not that person's fault. You just have to make sure that the thing you're working on is relevant to your relative position, I suppose. So this was the argument. So go back to that in a second. So the thought was then trying to think about this in terms of architecture. If we imagine that there's a period of time where new ideas are, the germ of a new idea is first introduced into the collective disciplinary imagination. We don't know yet what or where or how, but somehow there's a stirring of it. And there were a few terms that not even sure that I used, but I think came up subsequently in discussions and then in the symposium. But let's say we would call this visionary work. I'm not saying visionary necessarily in terms of genius, but it's a kind of vision that is leaping far beyond the present situation and just understands that there's certain grumblings and possibilities, and I'm going to leap over all of these and show some other kind of future that no one is going to have any firm grasp of, but that happens, but it's out there nonetheless. And so we see Bruno Taut and his Alpine architecture published in 1919, but really worked on earlier than that during World War I. So there was no possibility, maybe not unlike our, obviously in a much more drastic way, but if we wanted to make a parallel between that and our own recent Great Recession, where suddenly there wasn't a lot of building going on and one could start speculating about things that had no direct application but could. And maybe we could think of the recent period of SCI-Arc like this. This was suddenly showing a series of crystalline glass buildings ringing the top of the Alps. Right? And I don't think the building industry was suddenly sitting up and taking notice about this. This was not that kind of a problem, but it was a kind of a germ of a thing. And then the term that came to be used, and I know, is plausibility. I know I was using it, and I know for a fact that years ago, Bob Somel, as he always seems to do years before anyone else, had been using the term unlikely plausibility, I think in relationship to some OMA work and their justifications. I think Wes was using it in the context of some things. But anyways, plausible was this idea that it is not necessarily, so this is 1921, of course, this is Mies van der Rohe's Friedrichstrasse office tower. This again, I don't think was in my talk either, but was something that was referred to later on. And my contention was here a few years later, something different happens, that this is not Bruno Taut imagining something that could spark a certain imagination. This is, oh my God, this is in our city. This is a kind of architectural possibility, or at least it seems somehow plausible. This is so this is saying this is a very far distance between this and the idea of it being feasible. Yes, that pencils out, or even worse, being practical. But it is this idea that it is not simply to the realm of, gee, you have a vivid imagination. It seemed important, and I thought this was what the argument was that and we can tie this back into the discussion of politics, but I think the idea of its feasibility is where it introduces a kind of more pointedly political intervention into something beyond architecture, right? So it's not unrelated, it's the kind of vehicle through which one apprehends the political possibility. So this happens, and then we know, I don't know, I have, maybe Todd can help us, the first all-glass tower. I don't know what it is. I'm sure it's post-World War II. This is certainly a very early one, so this is the Lever House in New York by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill Gordon, Bunshoft, 1951, so this is, 30 years later, and another war, another great war in between. And so then it becomes, obviously, when SOM does it, this is not merely plausible, it's actually feasible. So if, what I'm talking about is something much closer to the Big Bang, then, so I'm not trying to argue for a kind of brass tacks, this works. Rather, it's to see it in this kind of spectrum. Interestingly enough, just as an aside, of course, kitty corner from this is Mises Seagram's building, which is even a few years later, and he actually never built an all-glass tower. So there you go. Turns out didn't find it that interesting. So, pragmatic thoughts on a plausible thesis. Pragmatic, I suppose, in the sense of pragmatic philosophy, the idea of working directly with the reality of things. So what would this mean then? One thing that is a question, and in fact I'll address in a minute as to my mind, at least at a personal professional level, a kind of crisis, is how one does things in advance of a built work to either get to that built work or to make that future construction be understood in a very visceral way as a possibility. Does that make sense? Like very simple things. You show people a picture of what it's going to look like, you make a model. I'm going to argue that these are a little bit problematic, and we need to, I feel like this is where I'll get to the end where I really have rough notes on what this means exactly. But to go back to this for a minute, here is another view of the Friedrichstrasse Tower by Mies. What is interesting is there is something about a contemporary intuition of the city, which you can imagine at this point, photography of the city, you know, especially kind of moving streetscapes as opposed to carefully framed panoramas, were very much of the time and felt, I would imagine, felt very much of the moment. And the idea then of a photo montage, that you can make a drawing, you can make a city, and you simply put the two together, I would imagine has a very different kind of, would have had a different kind of traction, a different kind of impact to someone seeing this than it would if we simply did the same thing today. So I want to, because the part where what is the nature of plausibility was a little bit, is still, I don't think we saw much last year that actually exercised or tried to find what that vehicle was in order to do it. I showed the Friedrichstrasse, not that one would do that, but to imagine what would be a contemporary version of that. I still have that open as a question, but I was suggesting a couple of things that we do that seek to verify its buildingness, which are all good and proper, but I think are not it. I think we understand, and you know, these are, you know, the incredible work that Tom and Herwig and Matt Melnick do with the kind of DD classes. Goes a long way towards education, goes a long way to getting us our accreditation. Thank you very much. But we understand you can have a really crazy shape and you can make some technical drawings of it. We're not saying it's easy, but that isn't like, oh my God, I can't believe you can actually draw a section of this kind of thing. It seems like there's a different kind of insertion into reality that we need. And I was also arguing the extreme Photoshop, you know, Photoshop as an extreme sports. Also at this point sort of leaves one understanding that, you know, we've seen Inception, we understand the CGI of it. It seems like it needs other, and when I was thinking about this, I thought, well, Mies, that was probably a bit of a, the photo montage could have been understood as an art technique at the time, I would imagine. I would have to do my homework on this, but if you're at the Bauhaus and looking at things at the time, you would understand the collage. And so he's taking something that's a very different kind of sensibility and trying to see that in terms of architecture. So I was thinking, this is fun. I'm going to show you two examples, both of which were my students. And in this one, this is an example of something that I think is maybe getting close to what I'm talking about, but the funny thing is I completely forgot that the student even did it because it was so under the radar. This is Paul Stolting, who graduated from here a couple of years ago. He did a tower in downtown Los Angeles, and this is the model of it. And then somewhere along the line, I guess on the wall, there was this photograph, and so it's funny, right? It's like, it just, wait. So it actually just slips into a bad snapshot that you wanted to just show someone that feel that someone hadn't cleaned up some junk, and in the background there happens to be the building. I thought this slips into a kind of contemporary, I don't know what, thing you see in a different way than trying to make, like we shouldn't do that thing that, I think doing that thing that architects do to present the building is kind of where it's not happening. Not saying we don't do perspectives of a building, not saying you don't do technical cross sections of it, but that's not going to be the thing that I think that maybe the plausibility can come out of somewhere else. And of course, Paul, for those of you that know him, he is quite an accomplished artist in his own right and is aware of things. And I was talking with Todd today, trying to remember this. Is David Reed is a painter that Jeff knows quite well, collects, and has talked about a lot. And something that I remember from he had done a series of things where this is a scene from Vertigo by Alfred Hitchcock, and then there in the background is one of his paintings. So it actually, this is even a little more complicated because it enters into a sort of different work of art and starts taking on a, you know, an odd life. I don't know exactly how I'd put my finger on it, but it's a funny thing. So I thought about this and I thought, You know, it turns out, I think, my theory is that actually this was already introduced by architecture back in the 80s, in the early 80s, by Arata Isosaki. He was working on the Brooklyn Museum. Some of you may know this was an extension to the Brooklyn Museum, and he produced a number of drawings that were shaded silk screens in block colors of this building in plan and in section. They were quite important at the time, because I think on one hand they were clearly a kind of a Beaux-Arts reading, but on the other time there was something stark and unreadable about it. And I think he was very interested in this and was trying to figure out a way to enter it into a kind of public sensibility. And so I think he's good friends with Larry David, and was talking to him about Seinfeld and convinced him in season 2 to introduce this into the chiropractor's office. It shows up several times in there in different views, and that's, you know. The other one is, and I'll talk about this a little bit at the end, one of my problems that I'm pondering right now, is there's a whole other extremely important line of thinking and work, and I would say accomplishments within architecture in recent decades, which is the sort of Dutch treat. Right? So we come from looking at the work of Rem Koolhaas. This is, of course, his competition entry for Parc La Villette that Bernard Tschumi won. This was extraordinarily influential at the time, and it was about taking a kind of matter-of-fact spreadsheet logic to a series of programs in a large urban park, and then something like a horizontal logic that he outlines in The Skyscraper in Delirious New York, and simply begins arranging these things across a field. And so the whole idea was that there was programmatic interfaces multiplied manifold times. And so this was a whole other park, where the park was not simply segregated off, but one could have wildly unpredictable sequences of events. Oops. This is it put together as an ensemble. And here's in a drawing. This is the proof that you have, you know, you ride a horse, you have telecommunications, you pick strawberries, you go through the nature park, you plow a field. And this concatenation of events, this cross-programming, which, by the way, launched 1,000 thesis projects around the world and quite a few professional projects, was extremely important in that it re-engineered some fundamental ways we have of thinking about architecture. What it did not do, however, is re-engineer some fundamental idea of form. You know, the graphics of it and the formal sensibility is somewhere around a kind of 60s to 70s zipatone, you know, I should say 50s to 60s zipatone graphics mixed with a few deconstructivist angles. And there is nothing about this that doesn't simply borrow from other kinds of relatively easy sensibilities, right? There's no actual work being done here. There are those who would argue that is exactly the strength of it. It doesn't try to pretend, it doesn't try to fall into the formalist games playing of what the precise geometry and things should be. This laughs at that. Look, we simply lay it out here, and you just simply make a dumb drawing of it. There's the architecture. So we are obviously in a different kind of religion. Is that the right word? Here at SCI-Arc, but this is, you know, I don't think there's anyone who hasn't thought through this. So I'm going to show you this is another thesis student, Lung-Chi Cheng, and I'm showing this as well because I think the thought that one would leverage that sort of insight and hijack it into form problems that would be more proper to our discussion, I think remains a very important possibility. The reason I'm showing this is Lung-Chi worked on it, and I think it virtually completely disappeared in this presentation, both verbal and written. And so the strength, is Lung-Chi here? Good, okay. He's great, Lung-Chi is. This was, I mean, I want to point this out as a fumbled attempt. So the first one, Paul Stolting, I didn't even see it. He just sent it to me like, I don't know, and for some reason, like a couple of months ago. Like, really, you had that on the wall? And then this, because I know it, and I just saw it just disappear off the, and so the idea here was to basically take a kind of diagram. This is OMA at Cardiff, where you could have a form that goes between two different objects. So it's a theater that is two objects kissing, and you could have a third form in between it, and trying to bring that into the discussion of the sectional object. And we had just come, Lung Chi had been with a class that went to see this project in Berlin. This is Frank Gehry's DZ Bank, of course. And so this was a particular formal device that was not only based on the diagram of the sectional object, but the precise geometric power of that form. It is inseparable from that. It is not simply an egg. It is a frightening horse's head, in fact. On the other hand, what it also has is, for those of you that know it, the project is quite, the atrium is quite powerful. The interior of the head is a fancy conference room for the board. So one could argue he had to put something fancy in there because he convinced him to spend so much money. It is not in its programming political in the way that, say, an OMA project is. What Lung Chi tried to do, and it doesn't show up at all, is to have a series of sectional objects that short-circuit the circulation of some rather conventional school typologies of a corridor and a large multifunction room, but they would serve as an alternative subversive circulation for children. So the adults had to take a laborious way around to go from one to the other. The children had these funny shapes with little doors that they could crawl into and to achieve some degree of freedom from the adults before they were captured and forced to come back in there. So somewhere the circulation, the form, these things, you know, I think it had the possibility of coming together. This would lead me to another question, and this is something that I know, Ellen, I've brought up with you, and I realize what I'm going to talk about is such a logistical nightmare that you're going to hate me for. But it seems like there's a little bit of a problem that maybe has to do with this transition to, you know where I'm going with this transition to the plausibility. You were talking about the symposium where some students come up and present their projects. There is, as a rule, these have gotten very sophisticated, and there are some extremely cogent arguments put forward. When it comes time for thesis, it becomes, for reasons that make perfectly good sense, a art show / beauty pageant. It is about everything on there paying off in terms of its sort of seductive beauty, and the presentations go sort of kind of by the wayside. And I realize this from seeing it through the eyes of some first-time visitors here, that there's a number of things I think that it seems like some of the things we're talking about have to enter in a way that doesn't naturally want to be on the wall. Students have a certain amount of real estate, they calculate these things. So my thought was, even if, I'm just going to go with my idea. I'm throwing it out there. You have like a session with 6 or 7 people. Before the session, even if you had like a screen and each person just presents their let's say their thesis prep, modified to reflect where the project actually is rather than what they present it, then we simply go and look at all the projects, and they don't have to explain other than, explaining the particulars of the drawing. It seems like there's, in part, there has to be a way of interjecting certain things that aren't simply showing up on the walls into the discussion. Anyways, that was the end of my discussion of plausibility today. Clarifications and disputations. Here, this is funny. This is something that, this is just, I'll work on being cantankerous. How's that? Working through tradition versus citing that tradition. I think this is more. I'll do more Sorry, I'm just having a sip of coffee. And when, talking about T.S. Eliot, tradition and the individual talent, I think explains in a way that it's much more articulate than I would be able to of what it actually means to be working within a tradition. But the reason I cite it is because I agree with it, and I think that point of view is foundational to understand that one is working out of a complex body of work. But I think the operative thing there is that one is working out of it. It is not about thinking of that tradition as somehow giving you validating what you do, that it is not your passport for what you are doing to be architecture instead of not architecture. It's a big damn problem that you have to figure out how to get on top of and through. It sounds similar, it's very different. So this is countering the reactionary impulse to take refuge in the disciplinary certainties of the past. How's that? Is that right? It's reactionary. This is postmodernism. This is, oh my God, I don't know where architecture is going. It doesn't seem to make sense anymore. There were references where architecture made sense. If we could somehow change the trajectory of what we're doing to bring those references back into our work, then the crisis is averted and architecture has been propped up. So we have the one, which is overt. My friend, Sam Jacob, doing this work as fat. This was shocking. And I admire the fact that it was selectively reintroducing a virus that we all long ago lost our immunity to back into the population, and everyone's like, what the fuck? I didn't think anyone was doing that anymore. So it had its moment. If you don't think of it as political, you're completely missing the point. I know Sam well. I was wondering how he could possibly continue with this and what a firm named FAT could possibly do after this, him being a very intelligent and ambitious person. I think his answer was FAT doesn't exist anymore. I think this was an idea. This was a project. I think it's run its course. There is a kind of creeping postmodernism that I'm seeing around architecture, around surprisingly young architects who should really understand that it is, there's some point, it's all fun until someone gets hurt. This is actually bringing in, you can't, at some point it may seem ironic, but ultimately the things that these refer to and the kind of comfortable posture that these seek to find will infiltrate the work. And I think it is in a sense, a kind of fear of the new that causes us to do this. We understand, and this goes back to Kubler, the idea of strands of work, and every now and then things happen and then they die off because they're no longer relevant and time goes on. Sometimes it's very important to look back and realize, oh, remember that thing that everyone stopped working on? It turns out today it has a new relevance. There is that possibility, right? But that is, it is something that one has to do judiciously. If the strength of one's work is simply that it is an ironic return to something that we had done before, that's a different project. And then that's the overt version. This is the implicit version, the thin black line. So we all know this. We all. So this is not, gee, that looks like an old building. This is, it is more complicated. This is understanding that we have a field that has been composed of the careful geometric instructions to construct our buildings, and that careful geometric construction begins to become a way of thinking and advancing the field in and of itself. This is so fundamental to what architecture is that it almost doesn't require, when we talk about technique and architecture, if we look at the history of architecture, we're talking almost always about drawing, right? And almost always thin black line drawings. So it is not coincidental, this is not a trivial thing. And I think there was, and I know I myself was involved in making sure that these kinds of background questions did not simply lie there unexamined, because they hadn't disappeared, they were lying there unexamined, but they actually are brought to the foreground. Please understand, it was in part, I think this is important as a means of clarification. In part, it's also a kind of autopsy. And maybe it's an autopsy that is already too late and has already passed. So I want to just make sure that my own views on this are clear. Let me also make clear Perspective was radically revolutionary at one point. Then it became a fundamental way of thinking and putting together architecture at another point, and now it's something we can use. So when we talk about the discipline of thin black lines and its various accomplishments, this doesn't eliminate it as part of our possibility of work. It is so rich and so fruitful, it just can't disguise as a central current concern. It isn't. So, and this goes with, various forms of projection which serve as a kind of breath of fresh air against a world where everything is a rendered perspective. But it falls into that same category, right? So when I was saying that whole list of things that people had done before for thesis and all these topics, I'm trying to parse them out now. Ones that have to do with projections, drawings, and the discipline of drawings, I think is kind of beating a dead horse, as they say. And I think it's not fruitful to do that. And there is increasingly a kind of easy seduction of certain things. And as a small aside, when I was in graduate school, there was a lot of influence in terms of my teachers and others with things that Daniel Libeskind was doing at Cranbrook, certain things going on at the Cooper Union. We were there at a place where you have to understand politically at Harvard, this is, it maybe likes to think of itself as the center of the discipline. It's in fact the center of the profession. It is the Death Star of the profession, in fact. And so the idea of saying, if you make a building axiomatically, it is not architecture. Architecture must not be a building. You have to understand that this was upsetting, and it had a certain kind of posture that was, as much as anything, political there. Within a few years from there, it became clear to me, after you going around to all of these other schools, Carleton or wherever they were, there was an entire cottage industry of people who figured out, look, we can teach and be profound and never have to deal with the building problem at all. We'll make memory machines and viewing devices and all of this. So it's the same thing. Like, you can do this thing, it's really seductive. It just becomes an easy avenue to go into. So, and the reasons for it are clear. There's problems. I mean, we had, I always think of the two architects that kind of put a period, full stop, on these kinds of traditions of architecture, that is the end of the line, let's say, one being Aldo Rossi. Here is his cemetery in Modena, but in particular, I guess, the little floating theater in Venice from 1980 is the one I always think of. And then in another way, the other line, so one, the line as reinforcing the last echoed outline of the classical tradition, and the other one, the angle, the counterpoint, the undercurrent, the dark psychosis that the other one always sought to hit. So this plus and minus, this positive and negative of the two works here, the City Edge Project and of course the Jewish Museum, these really brought an end to that kind of reflecting back on a certain tradition. We have that in the same way that we have perspective, but we've got to move past that. The thing that becomes difficult are these, at least for me. The fallout from that is Libeskind's micromegas, where the possibility here was that, in fact, the architectural drawing simply becomes liberated as its own meditation. And the thought that this exists as an architectural work, this sequence, is something that's very difficult to get over. And I think in my own work, even though the rest of the problem had died, the idea that the architectural drawing still possessed architecture was a relevant problem. I'm not so sure now, if I can be. Okay, so here's a couple of other things I just want to straighten out here, and this is where there's a lynch mob. So on technique, architecture versus illustration. So this gets funny because we have the question of talent, right? And this was going back to Mark Rothko, is saying basically you need exactly enough talent to be able to do the project that you're working on. Doing a painting that is simply a display of your talent, and he contrasts Francesco Goya and John Singer Sargent, you know, a painter of a certain kind of Boston and London society, as Sargent as being far more talented, right? But Goya is the one that's the fundamental. So the idea of having a lot of talent and your work about displaying that, extremely seductive. It's a kind of adolescent seduction, but it is fundamentally not what a work is about and not what technique is about. So we have, and we see this. So you have something like a painting of Mark Rothko, which is difficult. It's a kind of mature sensation. And then we have the paintings of Leroy Neiman, who, you know, probably 2 people in the audience know, who used to go to fancy events and paint horse races and sports and things like that, and it was much more palatable to a certain Laguna Beach crowd of rich people who wanted to collect paintings and really liked the drips, but thought the Rothko was much too difficult. Or, you know, for as a kid growing up, not really being able to follow basketball so much, but thinking the Harlem Globetrotters were amazing, and if they ever played a real team, they would have 2 balls instead of 1. They would win. So as a kind of a youthful belief in, you know, it's a kind of adolescent thrill to like these things. I'm saying this because at some point one sees the difference or one doesn't. So if the difference between these 2 doesn't matter, I'm going to just say, you know, at your age, this. So, you know, this is another one of Daniel Libeskind's, a very difficult one, another sequence called Chamber Works. And the idea that this is architectural drawing and that Lebbeus Woods is architectural drawing is in a sense the same kind of fallacy. Mind you, talking about Lebbeus, a person whom I knew some, who was brilliant and had profound things to say about architecture, I'm speaking specifically about the work and its relationship. So this is, but I'm pointing this out because the difference between these 2 and thinking there's no real difference is fairly fundamental to the history of the school. I don't think there's been a director that sees the difference between these 2 and would probably prefer the one on the right. So I'm putting this out as saying it is the difference between architecture and an illustration of architecture, and at your age it either makes sense or don't worry about it, do your thesis. But if you have the sneaking suspicion that there's a difference, let me tell you, you're right, and there's a sizable dissension from the view that would equate these, that you can. And then the last one is more of an aside comment. I think this is about it. I'll just show a couple of weird things at the end, and that's it. Which is technique versus the merely technical. And I think it comes out of our recent digital past, where these 2 have become confused. And this goes back, and this happens repeatedly. I think if you read Walter Gropius talking about the sensibility of modern architecture, he will claim that it is born of certain kinds of construction techniques that became possible. In other cases, maybe it's certain kinds of drawing techniques like the axonometric that became possible. But I think there is sometimes the idea that one can take that the acquisition of advanced technical tools is the same as a technique. And I want to say that this is tricky. It is actually a dangerous position for one exact reason, because it is not wrong. The problem is it's half right, which is to say that it is the technique, it is the precise manner and art with which you put your project together, which very often has recourse to technical tools and sometimes not so much. It is not the defining feature of technique, right? We were talking about in my visual studies class of disegno and colore, which to my mind is becoming relevant in a number of ways. But part of it is this: the idea of doing a fresco painting in Renaissance Florence is you needed to know how to draw, and you needed to know how to carefully work up through a series of studies that painting and then to go about painting it. Oil painting made it possible to simply stand there with the canvas and your painting and start painting. So there was a technical advance with oil painting and linseed oil that was necessary to that. Painting has gone on for a very long time and continues to advance. Every now and then, acrylics come along in post-war painting. There's important technical advances, but it often advances completely independent of new technical things. So it is important to understand it is half-true. Right? Existential concerns. This will be elaborated later. Okay. Sue Foujimoto, I'm sure a lot of you saw this lecture. The toilet, right? I saw this and I thought very, very interesting. This is different than the OMA, right? You take a wall and you realize that wall actually has a series of different performances that coincide with one another in that plane. If I delaminate those, ones that you never think of delaminating, you have some fairly startling effect. So enclosure is one, privacy is another, and in between I insert a garden. And suddenly it's a quite unusual toilet that doesn't lose any of the features of the other toilet. So this idea of being able to take unexamined assumptions of the assembly and performance of architecture and surgically separate them out to such novel effects. And I think there's other diagrams of his that work out as well. Now, the interesting thing is the complexity. Like, this would require 5 visual studies classes in order to be able to arrive at this drawing. That was funny. It's like an oval, and it's like I could tell someone to draw this, and they could draw it, and that person wouldn't even have to be that much of an architect, and they would have it. Okay, so I acknowledge the power of the work. I look at this drawing and I think, well, boy, I'm heading up visual studies at SCI-Arc, which is the most complicated and convoluted set of visual studies courses in the history of architecture. I'm a charlatan, or this is not architecture, or there's some other answer. You know, the whole thing you're being led through in the school, I mean, like it or not, when you look at this, you think about what you've just spent all your money and time doing, and you ought to have a problem, right? Either this is right and we're fools, we're right and we have to figure out why in some way this is not architecture, or it's some big happy world where we all exist. I think that's become a kind of default way of working in my own mind, but I can't imagine that this is correct. And I can imagine a series of multiplying possibilities, but still one has to think about them relative to one another. This is so I have a certain problem with where the disciplinary tools are, and so the role of drawings and complex geometries, etc. And so I have a problem with it, but have been following it out through its end anyways. Here is someone else who probably sees a problem with it and says, oh, we can just get on without that. That's not really relevant. And then, so a couple of years ago I was talking about awkward, and it seems like that seems elegant and naive in the face of increasingly strange work, oddly enough by architects who ought to be decades and decades past when they're doing revolutionary and disturbing works. This is Frank Gehry from a couple of years ago, the Luma Park project in Paris. So this is, you know, the idea that the model itself is put through as a disciplinary idea is absolutely not here, nor here. This is another sensibility. This is a cast stainless steel bear that Frank Gehry did that someone shared with me a couple of years ago. So these are like studies for a new kind of construction that isn't falling into alignment with any of the tools that I understand. The lobby of the Inland Steel Building was solid glass pieces. They had to introduce new steel under the lobby just to hold this up. And then this project, which I just saw, the UT Technical University in Sydney, just finished. You know, why would you do something that is so wrong in its basic composition, in its, so here the bear shows up as a railing, and the oil canning of the what is the one in Minneapolis? That oil canning that people were complaining about seems, you know, trivial. Not the Walker, anyway, the museum at the University of Minnesota. And here we see it again. This is like precise bad construction. And then the last one, and this will be, I'll leave you with this. This is a real head scratcher. This is Gehry and Nouvel, who's one of these architects that he's one of the, what's the expression? He's never ever important until he is. So every now and then does a project that I just have to like, it's amazing, 1 out of every 200 projects. So this is the Philharmonic in Paris nearing completion. And this is literally, I think you can even see one of the La Villette Schumi pavilions right here. It's like landed on top of one of them. And I just can't imagine this would look like anything other than a bad model in model form. And to imagine that so if the idea of something that is so difficult in terms of sensibilities that we think of in relationship to architecture, which I think this is, and to realize that the tools that you could put together, let's say in the course of Thesis, to put on the wall, would be ones that look bad, that is my dilemma.